There are some stories that stay with you, not because of how they end, but because of the questions they leave behind. Stories that echo long after the headlines fade. Today's story is one of those. It's about a young father from Texas, a man named Bradon Lawson, who vanished in the early hours of a summer night in 2013 after making one of the most haunting 911 calls ever recorded. It's a story that feels like it should have answers, yet for nearly a decade, it only offered silence. You're listening to Echoes Beyond Crime. I'm your host, Katie, and today we're traveling down a lonely stretch of highway in rural Texas, where one call, one night, and one man's disappearance became one of the most enduring mysteries of our time. Bradon Lawson wasn't a stranger to hard work. Born in 1986, he grew up in West Texas, a place where the sky feels bigger and life often depends on grit. By his mid-20s, Bradon had built a life that, while imperfect, was full of love. He lived with his longtime girlfriend, Lawson, and together they were raising 4 young children. Friends described Bradon as kind, funny, and protective. The kind of dad who worked long shifts in the oil fields, but still had time to play with his kids when he came home covered in dust. But like a lot of people in their 20s, life wasn't always smooth. He had a minor warrant out for an old drug-related charge, something that lingered in the background, adding quiet pressure to daily life. And in the days leading up to his disappearance, Bradon was tired, physically and emotionally. On the night of August 8th, 2013, he and Ladessa had a heated argument. Accounts vary on what caused it. Some say it was over his long work hours. Others say it stemmed from stress and exhaustion. What we do know is that sometime around 11:30 p.m., Bradon left home abruptly. He told Ladessa he was going to his father's house in Crowley, Texas, about 3 hours away. He got into his silver Ford F-150 and headed north. By all accounts, Bradon made it roughly an hour into his trip before trouble began. Around 12:30 a.m., his truck ran out of gas on Highway 277, near the small town of Bradon. If you've ever driven through rural Texas at night, you know it's pitch black. No streetlights, just endless brush, barbed wire fences, and the occasional pair of glowing animal eyes in the distance. At 12:38 a.m., Bradon called his brother, Kyle Lawson, asking for help. He told him he'd run out of gas and needed Kyle to bring a can. Kyle agreed and set off to meet him, accompanied by his girlfriend, Audrey. But just minutes later, something happened that changed everything. At 12:50 a.m., Bradon Lawson called 911. It's a call that's been played thousands of times by investigators, podcasters, and online sleuths. But even after all these years, it still raises more questions than it answers. Here's the publicly released transcript of that call. Dispatcher, 911 emergency. Bradon. Yes, I'm in the middle of a field. My truck ran out of gas. There's one car here that got chased into the woods. Please hurry. Dispatcher. Okay, now run that by me one more. Bradon. Talking to him. I accidentally ran into him. Dispatcher. Oh, you ran into them? Okay, do you need an ambulance? Bradon. No, I need the cops. Dispatcher. Is anyone hurt? Dispatcher. Hello? Hello? That was the last time Bradon Lawson ever spoke to anyone outside his family. When I first heard that call, I remember rewinding it again and again, trying to make out the words beneath the static. The fear in his voice was unmistakable. You can hear the adrenaline. He's breathing fast, his tone confused and frightened. It's not a prank, and it doesn't sound like someone playing around. It sounds like a man who believes he's in danger. And yet, from what? By 1:10 a.m., Brandon's brother Kyle had arrived on the highway. He found Brandon's truck parked awkwardly on the shoulder, partially jutting into the road. Its doors were unlocked, and the gas tank was empty. Kyle couldn't see his brother anywhere. He called out into the dark fields. Nothing. And then tried calling Brandon's phone. At first, the calls went through. In one, Brandon told Kyle he was 10 minutes up the road. In another, he said, "I'm bleeding." Kyle later said his brother's voice sounded panicked. He couldn't make out exactly what was happening. A Coke County Sheriff's deputy also happened upon the scene, seeing the truck abandoned. Kyle didn't tell the deputy about the 911 call, partially because of Brandon's outstanding warrant. He didn't want his brother arrested when all he needed was help. The deputy assumed it was just a broken down vehicle, and after checking the area briefly, he left. Kyle waited, driving up and down the stretch of highway, flashing his lights into the darkness. When Brandon didn't reappear, Kyle eventually went home around 4 a.m., thinking his brother might have walked to a nearby house or gotten a ride. But by sunrise, there was still no sign of him. The following morning, when Brandon failed to contact anyone, his family reported him missing. Search teams were organized. The Texas Department of Public Safety, local sheriff's offices, and volunteers scoured the area for days. Helicopters flew overhead. Dogs tracked the brush, but nothing. Not a footprint, not a piece of clothing, not a trace of Brandon was found. That part of Texas is rough country. Thorny mesquite trees, knee-high grass, and patches of rattlesnake-infested scrubland. If Brandon had been injured, disoriented, or hiding, he could have been only a few hundred feet away and still invisible to searchers. But as days turned into weeks and weeks into years, questions began to outnumber answers. Now, I've covered a few cases over the last few months, and there's something about Brandon's story that feels different. Maybe it's the human aspect, the argument with his girlfriend, the decision to leave, the broken down truck, and that call for help. It feels painfully real, heartbreakingly ordinary. And yet, within that ordinariness is a mystery that has confused investigators and families for over a decade. What happened to Bradon Lawson after he hung up that phone? When Bradon Lawson disappeared that August night in 2013, there was no dramatic news flash, no helicopters on every network, no swarm of reporters. Just a worried family, a truck on the side of the road, and a 911 call no one could forget. In the days that followed, the investigation struggled to gain momentum. The location was rural, the kind of place where miles separate neighbors and cell service is spotty at best. But what investigators did have was that phone call, and that's where we begin. The full 911 recording runs just over a minute long. At first, it sounds straightforward. A stranded driver asking for help. But with every replay, new interpretations emerge. Law enforcement transcripts reads roughly as, "Yes, I'm in the middle of a field. My truck ran out of gas. There's one car here that got chased off into the woods. Please hurry." Then the dispatcher tries to clarify. "Okay, run that by me one more time." Brandon then continues. "We're out here going toward Abilene on both sides. My truck ran out of gas. There's one car here. The guy's chasing me through the woods. Please hurry." But static, wind, and overlapping noise make sections nearly impossible to decipher. To some, it sounds like he says, "I ran into them." To others, I ran across them. And then, silence. When I first listened to that recording, I tried to imagine the scene. The hum of crickets, distant wind turbines, and a man clutching his phone under a moonless sky, trying to describe something no one else can see. Whatever was happening, he was terrified. And whatever chased him that night, real or perceived, it drove him into the darkness. By daylight, Coke County deputies began a formal search. They walked both sides of Highway 277, checking nearby fences, culverts, and brush. Aerial searches were conducted in the following days, but terrain and heat worked against them. Kyle Lawson returned multiple times with family, volunteers, and friends, retracing every foot of land near where that truck was found. But for years, not a single piece of evidence surfaced. No shoes, no phone, no clothing. Authorities eventually towed the F-150 and confirmed it had indeed run out of gas. Inside, Brandon's wallet and keys were missing. His cell phone, however, had stayed active briefly, pinging cell towers near the same stretch of highway until early that morning. Then, nothing. The first and most plausible theory, at least to investigators, is that Brandon became disoriented and succumbed to the elements. It was pitch black, around 90 degrees even after midnight, in uneven terrain and wildlife. If he had been injured, panicked, or dehydrated, he could have wandered for miles off course. Searchers noted that thick brush can easily conceal a person lying only a few feet away. Texas wildlife officials have seen similar disappearances where victims collapsed in cover too dense for aerial visibility. But skeptics argue that this doesn't fully explain his 911 call. The mention of being chased, bleeding, and needing the police, but not an ambulance. Was it pure confusion? Or something or someone actually there with him? The second theory is darker. Brandon's call referenced a car and people chasing him. Could he have encountered someone on the highway, maybe a stranger who meant him harm? Locals in Coke County say the area isn't known for heavy traffic at that hour, but oil field workers and truckers occasionally pass through. One possibility, Brandon stopped to ask for help, and a confrontation ensued. However, police found no signs of struggle near the truck. No blood, no dropped items, no tire tracks from another vehicle. If foul play occurred, it would have required moving Brandon quickly and leaving no evidence, something difficult on a one-lane rural road. Still, the fear in his voice makes people question whether he truly ran from nothing. The third theory is often whispered online, but deserves acknowledgement, that Brandon may have been under the influence that night. Family members have spoken candidly that Brandon occasionally used methamphetamines, and his brother later confirmed that he'd likely relapsed shortly before disappearing. Meth can cause intense paranoia, hallucinations, and confusion. In that state, Brandon could have imagined threats that weren't there, run into the brush, and become lost or injured. To some, this theory fits the evidence: the frantic call, the erratic behavior, the sudden disappearance. But for others, especially his family, it feels incomplete, even unfair. Because even if drugs played a role, it doesn't explain the total lack of remains for nearly 9 years, or why his 911 call sounded like more than fear of shadows. A smaller but persistent theory points toward possible miscommunication or confrontation with local law enforcement. Brandon's family has questioned whether an officer may have encountered him after the 911 call. At least one deputy was in the area that night, and the timing of radio logs overlaps with the last pings of Brandon's phone. However, investigators and dispatch records show no confirmed contact between deputies and Brandon. No body cam footage, no incident report, nothing to suggest a pursuit or altercation. Still, the theory persists in online communities that analyze every second of the audio. Some listeners even claim to hear distant voices or sirens in the background, though experts attribute this to disorientation. Some listeners even claim to hear distant voices or sirens in the background, though experts attribute this to distortion and interference. There's also the idea that Brandon accidentally stumbled upon something he wasn't meant to see, perhaps illegal activity out on the highway. It's speculation, but in rural Texas, drug trafficking and poaching occasionally cross those back roads. If Brandon saw something and panicked, it could explain why he mentioned being chased. No physical evidence ever supported this, but it remains a haunting what if. Years later, online communities began dissecting the 911 recording using digital filters and sound isolation. Some claimed to hear phrases like, "We're not talking to them. I ran into them. They shot the first guy." Others insisted it was simply distortion. Law enforcement, for their part, never endorsed any alternate transcriptions, but did confirm the fear in Brandon's voice was genuine. As I listened with headphones, late at night, volume high, I felt the same frustration countless people online have felt. Every time you think you've decoded a word, the static shifts, the meaning changes. It's like he's trying to grab smoke. And maybe that's the truest metaphor for this case, a story always just beyond reach. For years, Brandon's family refused to let the case fade. They raised money for searches, organized volunteer teams, and contacted private investigators. His girlfriend, Ladesta Lofton, was often criticized unfairly online. People quick to blame her for the argument that preceded his disappearance. But by all accounts, she worked tirelessly behind the scenes to find him, to raise their kids, to keep the hope alive. Brandon's father publicly begged for renewed searches, reminded the community that his son wasn't a headline. He was a person, a brother, a dad, someone loved. And Kyle, the brother who last heard his voice, carried guilt for years, wondering if he should have stayed longer that night, called earlier, done something different. Those are the echoes of cases like this, the what-ifs that never quiet down. By 2022, nearly 9 years had passed since Brandon vanished. The case had become one of Texas's most discussed disappearances, debated endlessly, analyzed from every angle, yet unresolved. But then, in February of that year, searchers returned once more to the same area where his truck had been found, and this time, something was different. They discovered clothing, a pair of shoes, and skeletal remains scattered in a field less than a mile from the highway. DNA testing would later confirm what the Lawson family had feared and longed for all at once. The remains belonged to Bradon Lawson. After almost a decade, they finally had a place to grieve. When I started researching Bradon Lawson's case, I knew the ending would be difficult, but I wasn't prepared for how heavy the truth would feel. For nearly a decade, his family searched the same patch of Texas land again and again. They spoke to the media, they organized fundraisers, they begged for answers. And then, on a cold day in February 2022, a volunteer searcher found something small, a piece of clothing caught in the brush. Nearby were human remains. The location? Less than a mile from where Brandon's truck had broken down that night in 2013. For years, that field had been combed by helicopters, dogs, and dozens of searchers. It had been walked and rewalked, and still, somehow, he had been there all along. After the remains were recovered, investigators from Coke County Sheriff's Office and Texas Rangers secured the scene. Personal items found nearby, a pair of shoes, shorts, and a phone case, were consistent with what Bradon had been wearing when he disappeared. In 2023, DNA testing by the University of North Texas Center for Human Identification confirmed the identity. It was Bradon Lawson. His family finally got the call they'd both dreaded and prayed for. There was no evidence of foul play, no bullet wounds, no broken bones that could be identified. Given the condition of the remains after so many years, the medical examiner could not determine the exact cause of death. But investigators concluded the simplest explanation: that Bradon likely became disoriented, possibly dehydrated or injured, and collapsed in the thick brush where searchers couldn't see him. In the end, the facts are limited. Bradon ran out of gas around midnight. He called his brother and then called 911, sounding terrified. His truck was found empty. His phone went dead shortly after 1 a.m. 9 years later, his remains were found close by. Everything in between, every shadow, every sound, every heartbeat of fear in that call remains unknown. I've spent hours listening to that 911 recording, reading interviews, and hearing from people who still can't stop thinking about this case. And every time I come back to the same feeling, that moment of panic. In that 1 minute of audio, we hear something primal, a man who feels haunted, alone, and desperate for someone to find him. Maybe it was paranoia. Maybe it was something he imagined. Or maybe, for reasons we'll never fully understand, there really was someone or something out there that night. What I do know is this: every missing person story is a map of small choices, arguments, detours, broken gas gauges, and phone calls that change everything. Bradon's story reminds us how thin the line can be between safety and chaos, between home and nowhere. For the Lawson family, the discovery brought both heartbreak and peace. They buried Bradon close to home in 2023. Kyle, his brother, released a statement saying this, quote, "We finally brought him home. After all the years of searching, all the rumors, we can finally let him rest," end quote. His girlfriend, Ladessa Lofton, spoke quietly to local media, thanking the volunteers who never stopped looking. She said that even though they'd argued that night, they loved each other deeply, and she wanted people to remember Bradon as the man he was, not the mystery he became. Online, the true crime community, who'd followed this case for years, responded with an outpouring of messages, condolences, and something that rarely happens in cases like this: a moment of silence. Because at the end of it all, Bradon's story wasn't a riddle to be solved. It was a human tragedy that touched thousands of strangers who never even met him. I still think about that call. I picture Bradon alone on that highway, the sky stretching endlessly above him, the wind cutting through the grass. His voice carried over a cell tower into the static, and then into history. That's what an echo really is: a sound that keeps bouncing long after the source is gone. And Bradon's echo is still here, in every person who remembers his name, in every family still searching for their missing loved one, in every listener who can't shake the feeling that this could happen to anyone. When I cover cases like this, I always ask myself, what are we supposed to take away? Because there's no justice to point to, no trial to follow, no clear villain. There's just grief and the faint comfort of knowing that a family finally has somewhere to place flowers. But maybe that's the lesson, that sometimes closure isn't about answers. It's about acceptance. Bradon Lawson's story isn't about one bad night. It's about how fragile life can be and how fiercely families fight to keep hope alive when everything else is gone. So today, wherever you are, take a moment to remember him: a father, a brother, a son, a man whose voice still carries across the airwaves, asking for help. Thank you for joining me today on Echoes Beyond Crime. If you're listening on YouTube, be sure to subscribe and give this episode a thumbs up. It really helps the channel grow and helps more people discover these stories. And if you're listening on Spotify, please leave a review and share the episode. Because every share, every listen, every echo keeps these stories alive. Until next time, I'm Katie, and this is Echoes Beyond Crime.